Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into ways to improve your English accent and fluency, and we're pulling some great insights from How to Improve Your Accent, Graded Reader. Learn English through story. Improve your English for this one.
It's such an interesting book because it really brings language learning to life. It uses all these stories and real-life examples to show you how to use the language instead of just focusing on dry grammar rules.
It's a much more engaging approach for sure. Like, there's this story about a cafe owner who communicates with customers really well, even with pretty limited English, and she just uses like super simple sentences.
Yeah, and it just proves that connecting with your listener, like really making them feel comfortable, is more important than having this huge vocabulary. She's clearly got a good business going.
That's a great point. But I mean, you can only get so far with just basic phrases, right? At some point, you need more words to really express yourself, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the book talks about these vocabulary milestones, which
Yeah.
I found fascinating. Like they suggest 1,000 words as this sort of baseline for basic conversations.
Okay, 1,000 words. But what does that actually allow you to do? Paint me a picture.
Well, imagine this. You can greet people. You can order food. You can ask for directions. You're not going to be having deep philosophical debates, but you can get by, meet your basic needs.
Right, right. So what happens when you reach that next milestone? Let's say you hit 2,000 words. What changes then?
Well, with 2,000 words, you can suddenly talk about your day, your hobbies, even current events. You can
Hmm.
really start expressing your opinions and sharing more about yourself.
I can see how that would open up so many more possibilities. It's like you're leveling up your communication skills.
Exactly. And then when you reach 3,000 words, it's like a whole new world opens up. You can have these nuanced conversations, share stories in detail, really dive into complex topics.
Wow, I'm starting to see a pattern here. More words, more doors open. But I think for a lot of people, the fear of making mistakes, of sounding awkward or having an accent, that can be a huge barrier to actually speaking, even if they have the vocabulary.
Oh, I totally get that. I think everyone who's learned a new language has felt that way at some point.
Yeah.
But the book has this really cool perspective on it. It encourages you to think of yourself as a student, not as a finished product.
So it's about embracing the journey, even if it's messy at times.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, imagine if you had to learn to play the piano perfectly before you ever let anyone hear you play. You'd miss out on all the fun of experimenting, making mistakes, and improving along the way.
That's a great analogy. It takes the pressure off. So it's more about focusing on the process of learning, not just on the end goal of speaking perfectly.
Exactly. And that actually leads into another point the book makes about fluency, which I think a lot of people misunderstand. They think fluency means speaking perfectly and quickly, like a native speaker, without any hesitation.
Which can be so intimidating. It makes fluency seem like this unattainable goal for most people.
Right. But the book actually defines fluency as speaking without those long, awkward pauses, even if you don't have a massive vocabulary. It uses this really fun example of some Brazilian football players who were considered fluent even though their English was pretty basic.
Wait, so they weren't using like complex grammar or tons of fancy vocabulary, but they were still fluent. How is that possible?
Because they were able to communicate their message effectively. They could express themselves clearly and keep the conversation flowing. Remember that cafe owner we talked about earlier? She didn't need tons of fancy words to connect with her customers. Fluency is about getting your message across, not about speaking flawlessly.
That's such a game changer. It makes fluency feel so much more achievable. But how do you actually get to that point? Does the book offer any practical tips for developing fluency?
Oh, absolutely. And you might have guessed it, practice, practice, practice. Consistent practice is key. The book emphasizes that speaking regularly strengthens the connection between your brain and the muscles you use to speak. It's like working out a muscle.
So how much practice are we talking about here, and what kind of practice is most effective?
Well, they recommend at least 30 minutes a day, but it's not just about talking to anyone about anything. They have some really interesting suggestions for how to make the most of that practice time.
I'm all ears. Because honestly, sometimes just finding someone to chat with for 30 minutes can be a challenge in itself.
Right, and it shouldn't feel like a chore. That's where the book introduces this idea of thinking aloud as a way to practice.
Thinking aloud, you mean like talking to myself?
Precisely. You basically narrate your thoughts and actions as you go about your day. So let's say you're making breakfast. Instead of just silently going through the motions, you could say, okay, I'm heating the pan. Now I'm cracking the eggs. Maybe I'll add some cheese today.
I can see how that would force you to use the language more actively. But does it really make a difference? Isn't it a bit strange?
Well, think about it. You're practicing vocabulary, sentence structure, even pronunciation, all in a low-pressure environment. It's like a mental workout for your English. And the book takes it even further, suggesting you try this thinking aloud technique in a magic park.
Okay, now you've lost me. A magic park. What in the world is that? Is this like a real place?
Well, not necessarily. It can be any place that inspires you, a place where you feel relaxed and can connect with your thoughts. It could be an actual park, or a cozy spot in your home, or even just a mental space you create in your imagination.
I'm intrigued, but still a little confused. So you go to this magic park, and then what? You just start thinking aloud in English.
The idea is to relax, let your thoughts flow, and even ask the universe for guidance on your language learning journey. Be open to receiving insights in different ways, maybe through a sudden realization or a new idea popping into your head or something you observe in your surroundings.
So it's like a mix of active practice and mindful reflection.
Exactly. It's about engaging with the language in a more holistic way, not just focusing on memorizing rules.
This is definitely giving me a new perspective on language learning, but I think we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about simple communication, hitting those vocabulary milestones, reframing how we think about fluency, and even this fascinating magic park idea.
And we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in this book, from overcoming shyness and dealing with unknown words to debunking the myth of talent and learning from experience.
I can't wait to dive into all of that, but I think that's a perfect place to pause. For now, we'll pick up right here in the next part of your deep dive, where we'll unpack this magic park concept even further and explore even more practical tips from this awesome book.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were kind of in the middle of this whole magic park thing. It's an idea that definitely takes a little getting used to.
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, it did seem a little, I don't know, mystical for my taste, but I'm willing to keep an open mind. So how does this magic park actually work in practice?
Well, it starts with just finding a space where you feel relaxed and calm. It really doesn't have to be a park at all.
Right, we talked about that. Like, it could be your favorite chair or a quiet corner in the library, right?
Yeah, any spot where you feel like you can just let your mind wander a bit. And then you can almost think of it as having a conversation with the universe or whatever resonates with you.
A conversation with the universe, huh? Interesting. So, like, I'd say something like, hey, universe, I'm really struggling with phrasal verbs. Can you throw me a bone here?
You could. Or just kind of focus on the question in your mind. It's not about speaking out loud necessarily. It's more about being receptive to insights, however they come to you.
So, like, I wouldn't necessarily hear a booming voice answering my phrasal verb question.
Maybe not a booming voice, but it could be a sudden memory of a lesson you had or a new way of looking at the problem that just pops into your head. It's about being open to those little aha moments.
I see. It's almost like a form of meditation, but with a language learning twist.
You could say that. The book encourages you to really pay attention to your surroundings, too. You might notice things you hadn't before, and sometimes those observations can connect back to the language you're learning in interesting ways.
So it's not about magically downloading fluency, but rather creating a space where those aha moments are more likely to happen.
Exactly. And the magic park, whether it's an actual place or just a state of mind, is a metaphor for that space. It's a space where you can let go of self-judgment and be open to new possibilities.
I like that. It takes the pressure off of having to be perfect all the time. Which reminds me, the book also talks about learning from experience, not just from textbooks.
Oh, absolutely. It encourages you to get out there and actually use the language, even if it feels scary at first.
I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. It's easy to get comfortable with studying, but actually speaking can be terrifying.
For sure. But the book reminds us that mistakes are a natural part of learning. Every time you stumble or make a mistake, you're actually creating an opportunity to learn and grow.
So it's about embracing those oops moments and using them as fuel for improvement.
Exactly. The book even suggests viewing mistakes as valuable feedback, not as failures. Each time you make a mistake, you're learning something new about the language and about yourself as a learner.
That's a really empowering way to look at it. So instead of trying to avoid mistakes at all costs, it's about using them as stepping stones on the path to fluency.
Right. And remember, fluency isn't about speaking perfectly. It's about communicating effectively. And that takes practice, practice, practice.
Okay, so we're back to practice. The book recommends at least 30 minutes a day, but let's be real, a lot of people have busy lives. How can they realistically fit that into their schedules?
Well, the thinking aloud technique we talked about earlier, that's a great way to squeeze in practice throughout the day. But the book also emphasizes the importance of having a language partner to chat with regularly.
Finding a language partner can be tough, though, especially if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
True, but there are so many online resources now that connect you with language partners from all over the world. Have you tried any of those?
I have, and there are also apps and websites where you can practice with native speakers through video calls or even games. It's amazing.
The key is to find something that works for you and fits into your lifestyle. Consistency is more important than intensity. Even if you can only spare 15 minutes a day, it's better than doing nothing at all.
That's great advice. It makes language learning feel a lot less overwhelming. So, to recap, we've talked about the magic park, the importance of learning from experience, and making consistent practice a priority.
We have. And we've also touched on the importance of having a language partner and embracing those oops moments as opportunities for growth.
And I remember you mentioning earlier that the book uses stories to illustrate these concepts. Are there any specific examples of how people have actually used these techniques successfully?
That's a great question. And it's actually the perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive. Remember that cafe owner we talked about? Well, her story actually continues throughout the book, and it really highlights how all of these ideas can be applied in real life.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Let's hear more about this cafe owner and her journey in the next part.
All right, so we left off talking about that cafe owner and her journey with English. Her name is Maria, and the book actually follows her as she uses all these techniques we've been talking about to improve her English. Like, remember those vocabulary milestones? She starts by really focusing on mastering that first 1,000 words.
And she's using them with her customers at the cafe, right? Putting it all into practice.
Exactly. She starts with simple greetings, figures out how to take orders, and practices describing all the items on her menu using just those basic words.
Talk about a perfect real-world learning environment. I bet those daily interactions were super valuable.
Oh, totally. It's learning by doing, which is so important. And as she gets more comfortable, she starts incorporating that thinking aloud technique.
So like she's narrating her whole coffee-making process to her customers. Okay, now I'm adding the espresso, a dash of cinnamon.
Well, not quite to her customers, but she does it in her head. Like as she's frothing the milk or pulling an espresso shot, she's describing each step to herself in English.
That's brilliant. She's turning her everyday work into a language learning opportunity.
And the book really highlights how that kind of consistent practice helps her internalize the language and her confidence grows like crazy.
That makes sense. So what about the whole magic park thing? Does she have a favorite spot she goes to?
Well, get this. She finds her magic park right there in the cafe. After she closes up each night, she just sits quietly in the kitchen and takes a few moments to reflect.
Wow, that's perfect. It's like her own little sanctuary, a place to connect with her thoughts and ask the universe for some guidance on her language journey.
And the book really emphasizes that her progress isn't always smooth sailing, you know. There are days when she feels stuck or frustrated, but she just keeps reminding herself that fluency is a marathon, not a sprint.
She doesn't give up. And it pays off, right?
It totally does.
Yeah.
Remember that narrator from the beginning of the book? Well, it turns out he's one of Maria's customers at the cafe. He's so inspired by her dedication that he decides to give those same techniques a try.
Talk about a full circle moment. It's like Maria's passion for language learning ends up inspiring someone else to start their own journey.
Exactly. And I think that's what I love most about this book. It shows that anyone, anywhere can achieve fluency. It's all about finding the right tools and techniques that work for you and then just embracing the whole process.
Well said. We've covered so much in this deep dive: the power of simplicity, those vocabulary milestones, reframing how we think about fluency, the magic park, learning from experience.
And we've seen how those ideas can play out in the real world with Maria as our guide.
So to our listener, what's the one key takeaway you'd like to leave them with? What's the most important thing they should remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that fluency is a journey, not a destination. Enjoy the process, celebrate the small wins, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way.
Beautifully said. And remember, you already have the most powerful tool for language learning, your own unique voice and perspective. So get out there, keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself.
And that wraps up our deep dive for today. Until next time, happy learning.